Parts of the Carolina coast are already underwater. Some towns just picked up more rain in a single day than they normally see across 2 full months of summer. And this flooding disaster is only the opening act. The same jammed wet. Her pattern that is drowning the East Coast right now is about to trap dangerous heat over the middle of the country and fire off round after round of severe storms across those same regions for days on end. Here is how one stuck weather system is doing all of it at once. And here is exactly what comes next. Right now, a slow-motion flooding disaster is unfolding across central North Carolina and up into Virginia, and the rain has not fully let up. It has been falling in waves since earlier this week, pouring through the night and continuing into daylight hours across the Piedmont and the coast alike. Forecasters placed a corridor stretching from southeastern Virginia down through the Outer Banks. Under a level 3 out of 4 flash flood risk, one of the higher tiers on the scale meteorologists use to communicate danger. That risk was expected to hold through the day before easing slightly, with forecasters noting there was still a real chance it could get bumped back up depending on how much additional rain fell in the meantime. A level 3 flash flood risk is not a routine call. It means forecasters expect the kind of rainfall that produces widespread dangerous flooding, not an isolated pocket of high water here and there, and that is exactly what has been happening on the ground. In High Point, more than 6 inches of rain had already fallen by early morning. Durham picked up over 3 inches, with spots in nearby Hillsborough topping 4. Roads have flooded across Wake County. Trees have come down onto homes and power lines. Thousands of customers across the Triangle have lost electricity as saturated ground gave way under the weight of falling limbs. What makes this particularly jarring for a lot of residents is that much of central North Carolina had actually been dealing with drought conditions just weeks earlier. The region swung from worrying about dry ground to bracing for danger, flash flooding in a remarkably short window of time. That whiplash matters because dry ground does not behave the way people expect once heavy rain finally arrives. It can crust over and shed water almost like pavement instead of soaking it in, which sends runoff straight into creeks and low-lying roads faster than anyone anticipates. Here's the part that matters most, and it is the reason this story is bigger than one bad day of weather. What is hitting the Carolinas and Virginia right now is not a single storm that rolls through and clears out by evening. It is the leading edge of a weather pattern that has essentially locked itself into place over a huge stretch of the county. And that pattern is about to do something unusual over the coming days. Today, it is drowning the Carolinas. In the very near future, that same pattern is going to trap a dangerous dome of heat over the middle of the country and set off wave after wave of severe storms across those same general regions. Before getting to what comes next, it helps to understand exactly what is happening right now. Emergency officials are actively telling people in low-lying areas to stay off flooded roads and move to higher ground. It helps to understand what these flood risk levels actually mean, because news forecasters do not hand out a level 3 warning casually. That tier is reserved for days when meteorologists expect numerous flash floods, the kind that overwhelm creeks and storm drains and turn low spots into standing water fast enough to trap people in their cars or homes. When that level of risk gets placed over a corridor, or stretching from the Virginia coast down through the Outer Banks, forecasters are telling you in advance that they expect a widespread, genuinely dangerous event, not some isolated, easily avoided problem. That was the call made earlier this week, and the rain has verified almost exactly what was predicted. There's also a strange twist buried in this story that catches a lot of people off guard, because much of the moisture driving this flooding did not originate anywhere near the Carolinas. It traces back to a tropical storm that made landfall hundreds of miles away near the Gulf Coast. Tropical Storm Bertha came ashore near New Orleans earlier this week as a weak, disorganized system with winds only around 45 miles an hour, then drifted back over open water before pushing toward a second landfall near the Texas coast. By any measure of wind speed, Bertha stayed a weak storm the entire time, and it was never expected to strengthen into a hurricane. But here's the thing about a storm like that. Even a weak, falling apart tropical system carries an enormous reservoir of moisture, and that moisture does not simply stay locked around the storm center. A stalled frontal boundary sitting across the eastern part of the country has been reeking down and pulling that deep, Gulf-sourced moisture hundreds of miles inland, straight into the Carolinas and Virginia. So the worst flooding is not happening anywhere near where Bertha's own center is spinning. It is happening 1,000 miles away, fed by moisture the storm released as it fell apart. That is one of the more counterintuitive facts in meteorology. A weak, disorganized tropical storm can sometimes end up more dangerous for people far inland than a stronger, tighter hurricane would have been, precisely because its moisture gets spread out across half the country instead of stale, wrapped tightly around one coastal landfall point. Forecasters even pointed out this exact connection this week, noting that while Bertha itself sat well to the west of North Carolina, The storm was actively helping funnel deep tropical moisture straight into the Carolinas, even from that distance. It is a good reminder that a storm's forecast track on a map does not always tell you where its real impacts are going to land. Sometimes the worst weather shows up nowhere near the storm symbol itself. To understand why any of this is happening at all, you have to look up at the jet stream, because the jet stream is the engine driving this entire week of weather. Under normal conditions, the jet stream moves storm systems along at a fairly steady pace, and a heavy rain event passes through an area in a matter of hours before sliding off to the east. Right now, though, the jet stream has buckled into a large, slow-moving wave, and the fronts and storm systems riding inside that wave have essentially stalled in place. There's a stalled frontal boundary draped across the eastern part of the country, and it is acting almost like a fixed line that keeps generating storm after storm along the exact same path. Meteorologists call this training, where individual storms form and then move parallel to the boundary, crossing over the same towns again and again like train cars rolling down the same track. Training is one of the most efficient ways the atmosphere produces extreme rainfall totals, because the total accumulation at any single spot is not just one storm's worth of rain. It is hours of storms stacked directly on top of each other in sequence. It is the difference between a normal summer downpour that soaks a town for 20 minutes and moves on, and a flash flood emergency that keeps dropping water on the same handful of neighborhoods for hour after hour, without any real break in between. This stalled pattern is not brand new either, which is part of why the ground was primed to flood so quickly once the heaviest rain arrived. The same broad dip in the jet stream sitting over the middle and eastern parts of the country has already produced rounds of severe weather and serious flooding across this same general region in the days leading up to this latest event, meaning the soil across parts of the Carolinas and Virginia was already saturated before this newest round of rain even began falling. That is a big part of why relatively modest rainfall totals are producing outsized flooding impacts. The ground simply has nowhere left to send the water. There is also a genuinely alarming layer to this story tied to where some of the heaviest rain is falling in the mountains. Areas in and around the Blue Ridge and the wider southern Appalachians have been picking up meaningful rainfall on top of ground that is still not fully healed from Hurricane Helene's catastrophic flooding back in 2024, when entire river valleys were. So when additional rounds of rainfall fall on ground that is still scarred from that earlier disaster, the resulting flash flood and landslide risk is elevated well beyond what the raw rainfall numbers alone would suggest. Mountains make everything about flooding worse in a way flat. Land simply does not, because rain falling across a slope does not soak in evenly. It funnels downhill into narrow valleys and streambeds, gathering speed and volume as it goes. A stream that looks like a gentle trickle in the morning can turn into a wall of water by afternoon. Add in leftover debris, downed trees, and soil that was already loosened by the earlier disaster, and you get exactly the kind of fast-moving, destructive flooding that has proven so deadly in these same mountains before. Now, step back for a second, because this is the idea that ties this entire week together. What is flooding the Carolinas and Virginia right now is not some standalone, isolated weather event. It is one output of a single stuck weather pattern. That same pattern is about to produce a common, completely different kind of disaster in a completely different part of the country. The same jammed configuration holding a front in place over the southeast is also building a large dome of high pressure over the middle of the nation, and it is setting up a corridor for severe storms that will keep firing along its edge for days. Think of it as one machine producing two separate outputs. On one side, over the east, the pattern has been wringing tropical moisture out over already saturated ground and flooding it. On the other side, over the middle of the country, that same pattern is trapping heat and quietly building the fuel for a fresh round of severe thunderstorms. Heat, flooding, and violent storms sound like three separate stories, but they are really one story driven by the same stalled jet stream that has refused to move on. And in fact, that heat dome is not some distant future risk. It has already been building hard over the last several days. A massive area of high pressure has taken hold across a huge stretch of the country, stretching from around Minneapolis down through New Orleans, and from Kansas City over toward Cleveland. Kansas City alone has seen heat index values climbing into the range of 106 to 107 degrees, with an extreme heat warning in place there. And highs across parts of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana have been pushing to or above the 100-degree mark. That oppressive heat is expanding steadily into the Midwest and Great Lakes, as the ridge strengthens and shows little sign of breaking down on its own. A heat dome works by trapping a strong ridge of high pressure in the upper atmosphere, and underneath it, the air sinks, compresses, and warms even further. That sinking air suppresses clouds and rainfall, which is exactly why the middle of the country has been baking under mostly clear skies, even as the East Coast drowns under nearly continuous rain. But here's the part that ties the heat directly to the coming severe weather threat, and it is the key to understanding why these two seemingly separate disasters are actually connected. A strong ridge acts almost like a boulder sitting in the middle of a stream. Disturbances riding along in the jet stream cannot punch straight through it, so they get forced to ride up and over its northern edge instead. That northern edge becomes a kind of highway where warm, unstable, moisture-loaded air at the surface collides with disturbances passing overhead. That collision is exactly what organizes severe thunderstorms right along the rim of the dome. So a heat dome is never purely a heat story on its own. It is also the steering feature aiming round after round of severe weather at the northern and eastern edges of the country. The heat itself deserves serious respect on its own terms too, because heat quietly ranks as the deadliest form of severe weather in the country most years, outpacing tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods combined for total fatalities. A dangerous, prolonged heat wave settling over the plains and the Midwest at the peak of summer is not just uncomfortable. It stresses power grids as air conditioners run non-stop. It endangers anyone without reliable access to cooling, and it becomes especially dangerous once overnight temperatures stay elevated and the body never gets a real chance to recover before the next scorching day begins. A heat dome does not simply sit there harmlessly, even on the calm, blue sky days in between storms, because every hot, humid, sun-baked day loads the lower atmosphere with more instability and more available fuel. When a disturbance eventually rounds the top of that ridge, all of that stored energy gets converted directly into the ingredients for violent thunderstorms. In other words, the very same feature baking the plains all week is simultaneously charging the battery for the storms that fire along its edge. Severe weather has already been rolling through parts of the Midwest and Great Lakes recently, with cities like Milwaukee, Green Bay, Chicago, and Minneapolis facing threats of damaging winds, large hail, and even tornadoes. As disturbances ride along the northern rim of this heat dome, this is very likely not a one-time event. A pattern this stuck does not typically break down on any convenient schedule, and current forecast guidance suggests it may simply keep recharging, sending additional rounds of severe weather sweeping across the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast in the days ahead, largely following similar paths each time the pattern reloads. There's a real cumulative danger that comes with getting hit by disturbance after disturbance riding along the same stuck pattern. A first round of storms knocks down trees and power lines and leaves repair crews stretched thin. A second round hits communities that are already cleaning up debris, already dealing with power outages, already sitting on, say, deteriorated ground. By the time a third round arrives, rivers are running high, the ground has no capacity left to absorb more water, and the overall tolerance for any additional wind or rain has essentially disappeared. A pattern capable of delivering several organized severe weather days to the same general corridor is not simply 3 times as bad as a single storm passing through. The impacts genuinely compound on each other, which is exactly what makes a stuck weather pattern like this one so much more dangerous than any single storm ever could be on its own. Emergency crews in some of the hardest hit areas are already dealing with exactly this kind of layered exhaustion, still clearing debris and restoring power from earlier rounds of severe weather, even as fresh warnings go out for the next system moving in behind it. That stretches already thin resources even further and slows down recovery efforts across the board. Here is what deserves your attention looking further ahead. The farther out forecasters try to look past the next couple of days, the more that confidence naturally drops, and that growing uncertainty is itself worth paying attention to. A pattern this deeply stuck rarely breaks down near TLI or on a convenient timeline. Current guidance suggests it may simply keep reloading, continuing to send waves of severe weather toward the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast, even beyond what forecasters can currently pin down with real confidence. That is really the unsettling core of this entire setup. Every time this pattern recharges, it tends to aim at ground it has already worked over before, regions it has already soaked with rain, or regions it has already battered with severe storms. The flooding currently unfolding across the East Coast is really just the opening move. Now, the heat and the multi-day severe weather corridor building across the middle of the country represent the next act. And because forecasters genuinely cannot yet say with confidence when this pattern will finally break down and move on, it would be a mistake to assume there will not be a third act layered on top of that. So here is what actually matters if any of this affects you directly. If you are in the Carolinas or Virginia right now, this flooding threat has not fully passed. Even once the heaviest rain eases, the ground stays saturated and rivers and creeks can keep rising for a while afterward, meaning it does not take much additional rain to push already flooded areas over the edge. Never drive through water covering a road. Moving water only a foot or 2 deep is enough to sweep a car off the pavement, and most people who die in these flooding events die inside their own vehicles after underestimating water they thought they could cross safely. If you live in a low-lying area anywhere along this corridor, Keep paying close attention to local alerts over the coming days, and make sure you actually have a way to receive those alerts overnight, since a surprising number of these flash flood emergencies develop after dark, when people are least likely to be checking the news. If you live anywhere across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, or the Northeast, now is genuinely the time to make sure you know exactly how you will receive severe weather warnings before storms actually arrive. Not scrambling to figure it out once the sky is all ready, turned dark, and the sirens are going off. It is also worth checking on elderly neighbors or relatives anywhere under that extreme heat warning umbrella, since heat-related illness can develop quietly and quickly, especially for anyone without reliable air conditioning or a way to cool down overnight. The single most important question right now is not really what any one individual storm ends up doing. It is when this entire stuck weather pattern finally lets go. And until it does, the same regions across this country are going to keep absorbing hit after hit from a weather system that, for now, simply refuses to move. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for one weather pattern to produce this many distinct hazards at the same time. Most weeks, a flooding event in the Carolinas, a heat wave in the plains, and a severe weather outbreak in the Midwest would be treated as three separate news stories with three separate causes. The fact that all three are being generated by one locked-in atmospheric configuration is what makes this particular stretch of weather worth tracking so closely. It is not that the country is simply having a rough patch of unrelated bad luck. It is that the atmosphere has found a shape it does not want to let go of, and that shape happens to be one of the most disruptive configurations it can take heading into peak summer. It also helps to understand why patterns like this get stuck in the first place. The jet stream typically flows in a relatively flat, fast-moving band around the globe, which is why weather usually moves through in a matter of hours or a day or two at most. But under certain conditions, that flow can buckle into a series of large, slow-moving G-waves, sometimes called a blocking pattern. Once a block sets up, it can behave almost like a traffic jam in the atmosphere. Systems that would normally slide through in a day instead pile up behind the block or get steered around it along the same repeating paths. Blocking patterns are notoriously difficult to forecast with precision once you get more than a few days out, which is exactly why confidence drops. The further you look into next week, even though the overall shape of the pattern, heat in the middle of the country, storms along its northern edge, and lingering flood risk in the east, is not expected to change dramatically anytime soon. There's also a broader seasonal context worth mentioning. Summer is historically the time of year when the jet stream weakens and retreats toward Canada, which is part of why blocking patterns like this one tend to show up more often in July and August than in spring or fall. A weaker jet stream means less wind shear pushing system, along, which gives high-pressure ridges more room to build and hold their ground for extended stretches. That is part of why this kind of setup, a heat dome anchored over the plains with storms firing along its rim and a stalled front dumping G, rain along the coast, is a pattern forecasters recognize as a recurring summer feature rather than some entirely novel event. What makes this particular instance stand out is the sheer scale of it. Nearly 100 million people under heat alerts on one side of the country, and a level 3 flash flood risk actively verifying on the other side, all tied back to the same stuck jet stream. For people trying to make decisions this week, it is worth thinking in terms of layered risk rather than single events. If you are anywhere near the Carolinas or Virginia, the flood threat does not end the moment the rain stops falling. Ivers often crest and continue rising for 1 to 2 days after the heaviest rain has moved out. So a creek that looks manageable today can still be dangerous tomorrow or the day after. If you are anywhere under that expanding heat dome, treat consecutive triple-digit heat index days as a genuine health emergency, not just an uncomfortable stretch of weather, especially for outdoor workers, young children, and anyone elderly or medically vulnerable. And if you are anywhere along that northern rim where disturbance after disturbance is expected to ride over the ridge, plan for the possibility of multiple separate severe weather days rather than assuming one round of storms clears the threat for the week. None of these three hazards exists in isolation, and that is really the central takeaway here. The flooding, the heat, and the severe storms are not three unlucky coincidences happening to land in the same week. They are three symptoms of the same underlying cause, a jet stream that has folded itself into a large stubba, born wave and shows no clear sign of unfolding on its own schedule. Until that pattern breaks, the safest assumption is that each of these threats can reload rather than fade, and that the regions already hit once are the same regions most likely to get hit again. This is a fast-developing, high-stakes situation, and the pattern behind it is not showing signs of breaking anytime soon. Stay close to your local forecast office over the coming days. Keep an eye on river gauges if you live anywhere near a creek or stream that has flooded before, and do take every flash flood and severe thunderstorm warning in your area seriously. even if the last one turned out to be nothing. In a pattern this stuck, the next warning is the one that matters most because this stalled system is not finished yet, and the ground underneath it has already taken more punishment than it can safely absorb.